Everyone, tonight we are going to talk about multi-tenant deployment patterns, like multi-tenant applications and then patterns for deploying multi-tenant applications. My name is Ryan Russo. You can find me on Twitter at Ryan Russo. I am a continuous delivery architect with Octopus Deploy. We make deployment software, and part of this demonstration I'll talk about some patterns, and I'll be demonstrating how those patterns can be achieved using Octopus Deploy as your deployment tool. So I am based out of Dallas, Texas. I am a former .NET developer, mainly .NET web development. Now I work with Octopus, working with customers and the community to work on their continuous integration and continuous delivery story to make sure that they're getting the most out of their tooling and their integrations with Octopus and other tools. And this is a picture of me from several years ago on the day that I found out that mud races and obstacle courses were not for me. It was a very expensive lesson, but one that I only had to learn once. All right, so these slides are up on the internet at multitenancyrusso.dev/slides. Don't worry about writing that down. I will put a link to these in the meetup event. I'll go to the comments and I'll add a link to this, and I'll add a link to my Twitter handle so you can follow me if you choose to do so. All right, so let's get into it. What are tenants and what are multi-tenant applications? That's what we're here to talk about. Let's define them. So I have a nice circular kind of definition. Multi-tenant applications are applications that support multiple tenants. Not very helpful, so let's define the tenants. In most cases, those are your customers, the different customers or companies or organizations that use your application. Now, these applications can include software as a service products. Octopus Cloud is an example of that, but like a lot of cloud-based tooling that you may use. Zoom, anything that has like your company name in the URL is probably a good indicator that it's a multi-tenant application. It can also be applications that you sell to customers and are deployed to their infrastructure that they host, so it's not necessarily things that are hosted in the cloud. And it may not even be applications that you sell. It may be applications that you develop internally for your company to use and are just used by different departments or different groups within your organization. All right, so we got the definitions. Easy. Tenants are just customers, right? No, not exactly. Tenants do not have to be just customers. In fact, I really like the Octopus definition of a tenant, or the definition we use within Octopus. A tenant is an isolated instance of an application in an environment. So a diagram that would show this is I have this environment here that has 4 tenants. It's 4 isolated instances of our application. They've got their own process, their own configuration. They are completely separate. So you can imagine this being a QA environment that has multiple versions being tested at the same time. You can imagine this as being the production environment, and you've got 4 customers that all have their own version of the application. So it's not just customers that can be a tenant, there's other things that we can model as tenants. That can be teams or individual team members. So a developer or a team working on a feature could be served as a tenant. It could be sub-environments. Say that you had a number of QA or support environments that were in use at your company. This actually is a pattern that at my first product I worked on, we had what we call support environments, and we had like 10 of them, and they were all just different versions of the same software running. Those could be grouped together into a support environment, and each one of those could have been called a tenant. It could also represent things like cloud regions or data centers. If you deploy your application in production to a Dallas data center and an Indiana data center and a Phoenix data center, those data centers could be tenants. Or if you're deploying to the cloud, maybe US Central or US West or European West, those regions could be your tenants. They don't necessarily have to be your customers. And there's probably other models that tenant serves well that I haven't thought of. If you have another case where tenants would work out pretty well, let me know. I'd be interested to hear them and add them to some demos. Now let's talk a little bit about what these applications look like. So I've got a few diagrams. So this is a pretty standard diagram for a multi-tenant application. We've got multiple customers logging into a single application is connected to a single database. And this actually models the first product that I ever worked on. We had hundreds of customers from different companies that would log in, and they would log into the same web application, and they were using the same database. The key is where the tenancy comes in, is each tenant has their own isolated set of data. So in this case, we've got a single database. You can imagine that the data is isolated by adding a customer ID or a tenant ID to all of your tables. So you can, when you insert the data for customer one, it has customer one's ID. When you pull the data for customer one, you query customer one's ID on the SQL query. You could also do it by having different database schemas. So each customer could have their own schemas with their own set of tables. That's another way of doing the isolation. A very similar process, or a very similar example of a multi-tenant application is this scenario where you've got a single app serving multiple customers, but each customer gets their own database. And this is pretty much the same pattern as the one previously. It's just a different level of isolation because it's not all the customer data is not in a single database. They're all actually isolated to where they have their own database, but they're still logging into a single application. And the final pattern that we're going to look at, and this is actually when we get into the multi-tenant deployment pattern, this will be the pattern that we're looking at, and this is where each customer actually gets their own application. So customer one has their own application they log into and their own database. Customer two has their own application, and so on. And this kind of matches that definition that we use in Octopus as a tenant. These are isolated instances of the application. These are the tenants. And you could make an argument that maybe this application isn't multi-tenant because it's a single application serving a single customer. And I can see where that would be correct, but I would argue that if you've got a setup like this where you're creating a separate instance of your application for each customer, you've done a lot of work for this to be manageable. You've created your application to where you can deploy it quickly for a new customer or a new tenant, to where it can be configurable enough to support this type of process, and you've developed a deployment process that actually makes this easy to do and manageable. Without that, this is not a very feasible task to spin up an actual independent application for each customer. So I think that's where the multi-tenancy in this pattern comes from. Before we move into the demos, let's talk about some considerations when deploying multi-tenant applications. And that really determines which pattern you're going to use. Is every tenant on the same version, whether that's a customer or internal or external customer or a different version within your QA system? Are they always on the same version? Do they get upgraded at the same time? Where's the configuration stored and how do you apply it? Are you storing this in a web.config or an app settings.json? Are you storing the configuration in the database, or perhaps in the environmental variables and on the target or the infrastructure where the application is being hosted?
I presume there's also not just configuration, but like logos would be different.
Right, so if you had different logos or different branding for those, I would consider those to be part of the configuration.
Yeah, but they're of a different nature.
Of a different nature, yeah, so different assets, right, so different CSS maybe, different logos, yeah, things like that. So it's something to consider when you're doing these deployments. Another thing would be, what's your hosting model? Are you putting everybody on the same virtual machine? Or are you putting a group of customers on a single virtual machine in shared hosting? And some customers, maybe they have an upgraded plan and they get dedicated virtual machines or dedicated infrastructure. Or do you have everybody gets their own Azure web app or something like that? So that's another question to ask. And then another one would be, do some tenants have extra features or a special step? Is there something that they have, like a custom branding would be a good example. Maybe there's everybody kind of has the same look and feel, but maybe some people pay extra, or their plan allows for them to have custom logos and custom branding, or something like single sign-on as a feature that they have enabled that other tenants may not need and may not want.
Or have their own domain name as opposed to a
domain name, their own domain name, static IP addresses, things like that. So anything that you could think of that would be varied between those tenants. Is that something you need to account for? for. And you may not. Maybe everybody gets the same features, and there's no differentiation between the two. But it is something you should consider when planning out what your multi-tenant deployment pattern is going to look like. All right, so let's revisit these kind of diagrams, and with those things in mind, we can kind of talk about what their deployments look like. So in this case, single application, single database serving multiple customers, everybody's on the same version. You can't, with a single application, they can't be running different versions. You could have things like feature toggles on, like if you're using a feature toggle library or you've written your own, you could have some customers that have different functionality, but everybody's running on the same version, the same process, the same version of the database schema. And everybody's in the same hosted. Nobody's getting dedicated infrastructure in this case. Everybody's running on whatever infrastructure this application is running. And likewise, this is, again, the same scenario just with different databases. You may have some ad hoc or some special deployment processes to fix database in a certain customer's database, but the schema is not going to be different. It has to be compatible with what that application is running. So even though the databases are isolated more in this example, it's still a single application, still a single version, everybody's running the same version. And when we get to this case, which again, this is kind of like our darling of when we get to the demo portion, this is the one that we want to look at the most, because when we start thinking back to those questions, we actually get the ability in this case. Customer 1 could be running on the bleeding edge latest version of our application. Customer 2 could be like much more conservative and they want to only run on like something that's been out for 3 months or longer. So they can actually run different versions of the application. They can have completely different database schemas. They can also have different features just because they're running in isolated processes. They don't necessarily have to have feature toggles to flip on or off who can see which areas of the program, though you may still want to implement those as just part of your deployment process. And then when we talk about the infrastructure, the hosting model, we get options here because they are isolated applications. They don't have to be running on the same host. They can be, they could be on a shared host, or they can all be separate. You could even run some customers' instances in different cloud regions that may be closer to them. So if you have customers that are on the East Coast, maybe you want to run it in the East Coast or hosted in the East Coast region for them. All right, so we're going to look at some examples. We're going to get to a demo, but first, because I am using Octopus as my demo tool, my deployment tool, I'm going to just give a primer on some vocabulary that we use so that we're all on the same page. We have a project. A project in Octopus represents your applications, so like your actual websites or your services that are running, your database scripts, your configuration, so your configuration variables, your app settings, etc., and your deployment process, the actual steps to deploy your application to where they're going. And where they're going is called a target, and that's going to be a virtual machine, a Kubernetes cluster, an Azure web app, some other platform as a service instance or platform that you're deploying to. So the actual thing that is hosting your application is called a target. An environment is a group of targets. So an environment like development may be made up of 5 VMs in a database. QA may be 100 VMs in 10 databases. And then production could be in the thousands. It's really up to you what model that takes. And then a life cycle is a group of environments. It's really the pipeline of how your application flows through your different environments. So you deploy to development first, then you deploy to test or QA, then maybe to a pre-production environment, then finally to production and disaster recovery. A release is a snapshot of your project, so your application assets, your configuration variables, and the process, so it takes a snapshot of that. And then you can apply that as a deployment. Take an instance of this release, a snapshot, and apply it to development, and potentially development and this customer or this tenant. And then finally, a channel is a way to have a different path for your release to take, whether that's a different path based on the customer or a different path based on I need to do a hotfix, or this is a version 2 release versus a version 1 release. So that's some of the terminology we're going to use throughout this demo. But let's go ahead and jump over into the demo. The application I'm showing today, it's a demo application. It is a animal adoption website. So think if you have, like in your city, you've got some animal rescues, maybe a dog or cat rescue or different types of animals. This is a website you would find out about those animals and apply to adopt them. So you can see there's a few things I'll draw your attention to. One is all the places it says internal, that's the tenant name, the customer name we're deploying to. This is an internal site, so that's why it says internal. So that's on the nav bar. It's in the banner on the main site. We'll also see that the data changes based on where we're deploying to. And then finally, in the footer, we've got the tenant name again, along with the version of the application that is running. So this is the application we're going to be using, and we're going to be deploying it using Octopus Deploy. So Octopus Deploy, this is our dashboard where you can see multiple projects. So all of your different applications that you deploy, your projects are listed down the side, your environments are listed across the top. In this case, I have development, test, and production. And then for each one of those, you can see what's the version of that project that has gone to that environment most recently, along with the date and its status. Green is usually good, success. Before we look at the projects, I'm going to jump directly into this menu item for tenants. So in Octopus, tenants and multi-tenant deployments are a first-class feature. We have dedicated features and infrastructure just for them. So if we go into tenants, we'll see a list of tenants which comprise of customers like Big Dog Sanctuary, the Dallas Animal Rescue, etc. We'll also see things that aren't customers, like my colleague Derek Campbell and myself are in here as developers that are represented as tenants. We'll also see regions, so cloud regions for Central US and West Europe are represented, as well as just a series of test tenants, so test 01 through 05.